This video covers the very first disclosure that you will be asked to sign, the real estate agency disclosure and election. On line 1, it states the firm name or broker, which is Realty One Group. On line 2, it will state my name, Heather MacPherson, as the licensee. And I make the declaration that we hereby make the following disclosure. Before a seller or landlord, or a buyer or tenant, enters into a discussion with a real estate broker or licensee affiliated with a broker, the seller and the buyer should understand what type of agency relationship or representation they will have with the broker in the transaction. The first type is a buyer's broker. A broker other than the seller's broker can agree with the buyer to act as the broker for the buyer. In these situations, the buyer's broker is not representing the seller. Even if the buyer's broker is receiving compensation for services rendered, either in full or in part from the seller or through the seller's broker, a buyer's broker has the fiduciary duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, and accounting in dealings with the buyer. Other potential buyers represented by broker may consider, make offers on, or acquire an interest in the same or similar properties as the buyer is seeking. The second is a seller's broker. A broker under a listing agreement with the seller acts as the broker for the seller only. A seller's broker has the fiduciary duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, and accounting in dealings with the seller. Other potential sellers represented by broker may list properties that are similar to the property that seller is selling. And the third type is broker representing both seller and buyer. We call this limited representation. A broker, either acting directly or through one or more licensees within the same brokerage firm, can legally represent both the seller and the buyer in a transaction, but only with the knowledge and informed consent of both the seller and the buyer. In these situations, the broker, acting through its licensees, represents both the buyer and the seller with limitations of the duties owed to the buyer and the seller. The broker will not, without written authorization, disclose to the other party that the seller will accept a price or terms other than stated in the listing, or that the buyer will accept a price or terms other than offered. There will be conflicts in the duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, and confidentiality. Disclosure of confidential information may be made only with written authorization. Regardless of who the buyer represents in the transaction, the broker shall exercise reasonable skill and care in the performance of the broker's duties, and shall be truthful and honest to both the buyer and seller, and shall disclose all known facts which materially and adversely affect the consideration to be paid by any party. Pursuant to Arizona Revised Statute 32-2156, sellers, lessors, and brokers are not obligated to disclose that a property is or has been the site of a natural death, suicide, homicide, or any crime classified as a felony. Also, owned or occupied by a person exposed to HIV or diagnosed as having AIDS or any other disease not known to be transmitted through common occupancy of real estate, or located in the vicinity of a sex offender. Sellers or sellers' representatives may not treat the existence, terms, or conditions of offers as confidential unless there is a confidentiality agreement between the parties. The duties of the broker in a real estate transaction do not relieve the seller or the buyer from the responsibility to protect their own interests. The seller and the buyer should carefully read all agreements to ensure that documents adequately express their understanding of the transaction. The following series of lines are your election portion. For the buyer, you'll be looking at lines 33 through 38, and you will check whichever box applies. Line 34, represent the buyer as buyer's broker. Line 35, represent the seller as seller's broker. Line 36, show buyer properties listed with broker's firm, and buyer agrees that broker shall act as agent for both buyer and seller, provided the seller consents to limited representation. In the event of a purchase, buyers and sellers' informed consent should be acknowledged in a separate writing other than the purchase contract. Lines 39 through 44 apply to our seller or landlord. The undersigned elects to have the broker represent the buyer as buyer's broker, or represent the seller as seller's broker, or on line 42, show seller's property to buyers represented by broker's firm, and seller agrees that broker shall act as an agent for both seller and buyer, provided that buyer consents to the limited representation. In the event of a purchase, buyers and sellers' informed consent should be acknowledged in a separate writing other than the purchase contract. And lines 45 through 48 will be your printed name acknowledging receipt of the disclosure, as well as your signature with the date. If you do have any questions regarding this disclosure or information therein, please reach out to me directly and we'll discuss further.